Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another Victober video. Today I thought I would tell you about some Victorian books that I did not like. This video was requested quite a while ago, I think, and I thought I would save it up for Victober. As you all probably know by now, I really love Victorian literature, but that doesn't mean that I like every Victorian novel that I read, and so I thought I would discuss some of the Victorian books that I have liked a little bit less. I picked out 5 Victorian novels to discuss with you today, none of which I enjoyed very much at all. Some of them are by authors who in general I don't like very much, and some of them are by authors who in general I really do like, and these are the exceptions. So, we'll get George Eliot out of the way to begin with. George Eliot is possibly my least favourite Victorian author, or at least she is the Victorian author who I don't like, who I've read the most of, so I feel more qualified to say she is my least favourite Victorian author than, for example, one of the other authors on this list who I've only read one novel by, so I don't really feel like I can judge his whole body of work on that one book. But I've read 5 of George Eliot's novels, and I think it's fair to say that I do not get on with her writing style. I could have filled up several slots on this list of 5 with George Eliot novels, but I thought I would just instead pick one, my least favourite of her books. As I said, I've read 5 of George Eliot's novels. I quite liked Daniel Deronda, though I had a couple of issues with it. I have no recollection whatsoever of Silas Marner. I didn't like Middlemarch as a teenager, although I did reread it again last year, and while I wouldn't go so far as to say I really enjoyed it, my appreciation for it certainly did increase. And then I didn't like Adam Bede, and I really didn't like The Mill and the Floss. If you'd like to know more about my dislike of George Eliot, I made a whole video last Victober called Goodbye George Eliot about why I didn't want to read any more of her books, so I'll link that down below if you want more detail on my general dislike of her writing style and the way she goes about doing novels. However, let's focus on The Mill and the Floss for now. The Mill and the Floss is one of my least favourite Victorian novels, and it's one of my least favourite novels of all time. It tells the story of a young girl called Maggie and her brother Tom. They are children of a mill owner, and the story basically looks at them growing up and their relationship and various other people that they meet, including a young man who is educated with Tom called Philip, and then there's also Maggie's cousin and her fiance Stephen. Now, I have many problems with The Mill and the Floss. One is just the fact that I do not get on with George Eliot's writing style at all. I find it really dry. I've heard other people say that they find her writing witty or interesting, and I really don't. I find it very dull and difficult to read, and I think that's just a real personal thing. It's just really not my kind of writing style. I found that in all of her books that I've read, even Daniel Deronda, which I did enjoy. So if you like George Eliot's writing style, that won't be a problem for you in The Mill and the Floss, but I know I just really don't get on with her style. The second issue is that not only did I hate every character in The Mill and the Floss, except for maybe Philip. Philip was kind of okay. I also had no interest in any of them. Like, they're all such despicable and boring people. Like, I just didn't find any of them compelling whatsoever, and I think there are the seeds in Maggie to have been an interesting character, except that for me, she's not really developed right. The book progresses oddly, spending an awful lot of time on her childhood, so that you don't really feel you know her at the stage of her life that she is when the kind of action of the book takes place. And the central relationship at the heart of the book, the relationship between Maggie and Tom as siblings, is just, I just find it utterly uncompelling, because Tom is such an awful person, but even though he is her brother, you just can't really understand how she can have any affection for him, because he's just so horrible. But not in an interesting way, just in a boring way. Another problem I have with The Mill and the Floss is the pacing. As I said, the book spends a lot of time on the childhood of Maggie and Tom, but what seems to be important in the book takes place when they're older, and it always felt for me like it was really weirdly paced, and I never really felt like you were getting to the point. The last issue I have with The Mill and the Floss, which is my biggest one, is that I think the ending is terrible. And I don't just mean this in like, there are other things in The Mill and the Floss where I know that like it's subjective opinion, it's just that I don't like her writing style, or I don't really get on with the characters, or I don't find the central relationship interesting, but I genuinely think the ending is bad. Like, for me, it's such an appalling cop-out. And actually, for me, there is the seed of an interesting novel in The Mill and the Floss. If it had started halfway through, and the ending point had not been what it was, but we got to see Maggie's life after some of the events that happened towards the end of the book, that could have been interesting, but the ending is so abominably bad. And I know not everyone agrees with me. I know that The Mill and the Floss is the favourite novel of Jennifer from Insert Literary Pun here, and I'll link her review down below if you want to get an alternate opinion. But the next book I want to mention is Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. Now, I don't have too much to say about this one, because it's not one like The Mill and the Floss that made me really angry. It just didn't really provoke any reaction in me at all. I found it really surprisingly boring for a book about pirates, which I thought would have been interesting. And it can't just be to do with the writing style, because I read Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and loved it. I really enjoyed that one. And I was really expecting to like Treasure Island, and then when I picked it up, I think a year and a bit ago, it just really fell flat for me and really wasn't engaging. There was something about the narrative style that just didn't lend itself to the story it was telling, and I just found myself kind of switching off in passages. And so the only two things I have read by Stevenson are Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which I really liked, and Treasure Island, which I really didn't. So I'm interested to know people who've read more by him, if there are other things by him that are more like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde than Treasure Island that I might potentially pick up. Because I'd heard good things about Kidnapped, but I have a feeling that it would be quite like Treasure Island, which I didn't like, and I found really boring for a very plot-driven story. So yes, let me know on that one. The next book I want to talk about is Dracula by Bram Stoker. Now, one of the reasons why this video is entitled Victorian Books I Didn't Like rather than Victorian Books I Don't Like is because I don't know that I can say for certain whether I don't like Dracula when it's been so long since I read it. Certainly I did not like it when I was 18, and that feeling of distaste around Dracula has stayed with me for quite a long time. But I do sometimes think that if I were to reread Dracula now, I might have a slightly different opinion on it. So I studied Dracula at A-level. A lot of you know the basic premise, though not as much as you would think, because I thought I knew the premise and I didn't really. But it's about a man called Jonathan Harker who travels abroad and meets a man called Dracula who may or may not be a vampire, and various different things ensue. Now, when I read Dracula 7 or 8 years ago, there were two main problems that I had with it. One was that I found the pacing not always great, and I felt Dracula wasn't always that developed, and kind of the ending I found a little bit anticlimactic. That was one issue, which wasn't that big. The second issue was to do with the way Dracula as a novel deals with issues of gender. Specifically the way it deals with kind of female sexuality, I suppose, and the presentation of the female characters in Dracula, which I found really problematic. And I do think that a lot of the reason why I have sort of disliked Dracula so vehemently for so many years is because I read it at a time when I was starting to think about gender a lot more and kind of becoming feminist, and so Dracula like really offended me in the way that Dickens novels I had read when I was 13, 14 hadn't. Saying that, I do think Dracula is like much more dodgy in terms of its gender presentation than Dickens is. Like, I mean, Dickens has some problems in terms of his depictions of men and women and masculinity and femininity and sort of gender roles, but I also think that in many of his books he has a very kind of nuanced depiction of male-female roles within Victorian society. Dracula is in many ways a book about the fear of female sexuality and why, if women are sexually attractive, you need to stab them with a stake. In the novel Dracula, as far as I remember it and as I interpreted it at the time, women who exhibited any kind of attraction for men, any kind of sexual attraction, were sort of punished by becoming a vampire, whereas the female figure who is idealised in Dracula, Mina Harker, is very, like, such an angel in the house figure, to the extent that, like, the most useful thing she does in the book is like know train timetables off by heart, and there is a huge focus on like how domesticated and sweet and loyal and sort of chaste she is and all of this kind of stuff. As a teenager, I remember being incredibly infuriated by the way that Dracula depicted women, but I do feel like if I read it now I might notice more nuances, and also that might not bother me as much. I'm going to make a video at some point in Victober talking about what to do when encountering problematic or out-of-date viewpoints in Victorian literature, which is something that happens again and again. And in general, now I can look past quite a lot of very problematic things in Victorian literature, and even if those problematic things might slightly bar my enjoyment of the book, they won't necessarily bar my like intellectual curiosity and interest for the book, I suppose, which I don't think was quite the same when I was 18. And I feel like when I was 18, I felt very much that Dracula was much more sexist, for want of a better word, than the other Victorian novels I had read, many of which did depict women in ways that you wouldn't today. But I felt like Dracula was much worse than the rest of the books that were being published at the same time. Like, it's been too long since I read it for me to say whether or not that is true. But I think if I were to reread Dracula now, while it might still frustrate me, I think I would probably have like more intellectual curiosity. Even if it would still annoy me now, I think I would probably find it more interesting than annoying now, in a way that I didn't when I was 18. I hope that makes sense. I have two more disliked Victorian books to discuss, and both of these are by Victorian authors who in general I really like, but these books were weird. They were really weird. The first one I want to talk about is the Two Destinies by Wilkie Collins. Now, I read this last October for Victorian October, and the further I get from it, the more I dislike it and the weirder I find it. I've read two other novels by Wilkie Collins, The Woman in White and The Moonstone, both of which I really enjoyed, and then I picked up The Two Destinies, which is a lesser well-known work by him. It's quite short as well. I think it's probably a novella. The Two Destinies kind of follows the story of these two people who know each other as children. He is the sort of squire's son and she is the daughter of the gamekeeper, and they are desperately in love when they are sort of like 10, and then they get separated early on in life, and the book kind of follows how they meet each other later on in life and are constantly kind of like haunted by the ghosts of each other's in dreams. And there were some things about the Two Destinies that I was enjoying. I thought it was quite an interesting premise, and I found the characters very interesting, especially in the ways they kind of keep missing each other and the ways in which the book kind of looks at issues of morality and prejudice within Victorian society. And I was, you know, going along with it. I wasn't absolutely blown away by it, but I was really enjoying it. And then we got to the end, and it was weird. And I don't mean like a Mill on the Floss ending where it was just a cop-out and I thought it was the wrong decision. I mean, like, I don't know what on earth Wilkie Collins thought he was doing. Like, it's just really, really odd and a really bad decision. And I don't know how anyone could read that book and be like, yes, that's fine, this is a fine ending for this book, and this is definitely the ending I was expecting, and this is definitely okay, and that's definitely how people would behave in such a situation. It's just really not. Anyone else who has read The Two Destinies, I would very much like to discuss the ending with you, because I feel like it's not a very well-known book and I can't discuss it, and I also can't really explain why I disliked it without discussing the ending and spoiling the book, which I don't want to do, in case you do really want to read it, although I really, really wouldn't recommend it, because the ending is bad. It's really bad. It's really not okay. And my judgment of all the characters just completely turned upside down in the last several pages, and I mean, what? What on earth was Wilkie Collins thinking? What was he thinking? And the final one I want to mention is The Well-Beloved by Thomas Hardy. Now, Thomas Hardy is one of my absolute favourite Victorian authors. I've read everything by him. I love all his work, except for this one, which I did not love and which I found demonstrably creepy, I suppose, is the best way to describe it. It's about a man called Jocelyn, and he has this idea in his head that there is this kind of like spiritual being called the Well-Beloved, who he's desperately in love with, who kind of like moves between women's different bodies, and he's kind of in love with whatever woman he believes currently like embodies his well-beloved idea. And so he falls in love with a woman, and then with another woman, and then he's a bit older and he falls in love with the first woman's daughter. Okay, that's alright, that's a bit weird, it's a big age difference, and he used to be in love with her mother, but you know, okay, sure. And then 20 years later he falls in love with the original woman's granddaughter, and you're like, what? What is happening? What are you doing, Hardy? What are you doing? Why? It's just very, very odd. And I don't think like the characterization and the motivations are good enough for me to get past that central premise and how odd it is. As with The Mill on the Floss, I feel like I should direct you to a rather different opinion. I believe Libby Stevenson did a review of The Well-Beloved a year or two ago where she discussed why she likes it and a kind of different interpretation that helped her enjoy it more. So I will link that down below if you want to go have a watch of that. But The Well-Beloved, yeah, that was not for me. So there we have it. Those are 5 Victorian books that I did not enjoy. Please let me know down in the comments if you've read these and what you thought of them. And if you've read The Two Destinies, what the hell was up with that ending? Somebody please tell me what on earth, what. So anyway, thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another Victober video.